We're drafting against the RotoViz Overtime listener community today, Shawn. It's myself, yourself. We are teaming up against 11 others of the RotoViz Overtime listeners. And we've done this over the past couple of years. This is the earliest that we've ever jumped in to do a listener draft. We've obviously done some early drafts for myself and yourself in the past, but this one's going to be fun. Our first one last year was on the 26th of June. This one is happening on the 26th of February. So next year we'll be doing our first one in the 26th of November. I think it feels like that's the trajectory we are on, but this is going to be fun. It is the Never Too Early FFPC $35 entry contest. Obviously, you play in this league against 11 others. Then if you are successful, the top two move along to the end of season contest, and you'll advance through to hopefully be in the final to have a chance to win that top prize. But Shawn, we are going to have a lot of fun in this draft. We have the 105. It's going to be a 60-second clock. We'll have some time. We'll have a look through. We'll preview our team. Then we'll do the draft, obviously. We'll then obviously recap it and see what maybe we could have done different. The one thing I can promise the people who are listening in is the ADP in this draft will probably be a little bit different to what you're used to when you're checking out normal drafts. We're going to have our listeners here knowing exactly what we're trying to do, Shawn, and they're going to try and outsmart us. So looking forward to this one.
That's always the fun part of these drafts, to draft with a community that sees things somewhat similarly, and they have the advantage of our rankings and the insights that we have put out there. Colm, we had a couple years ago results where we finished toward the bottom of the listener leagues. Last season, the team that we actually drafted in a listener league in the Superflex contest was the one that went on and finished 16th overall. That was pretty fun. So it could go either way here. We're going to have to be at the top of our game if we want to successfully compete with the listeners. Being at the 105 is interesting because this, by ADP, is the first spot that you get a non-quarterback. That's the Justin Jefferson slot. You can pull up that ADP draft grid over at RotoViz in the fantastic best ball tools that Mike Beers originally put together, and that Dave, Blair, Anthony do such a great job of keeping up and improving as we go along. But Colm, we're gonna be in that range there where we're looking at Joe Burrow, Justin Jefferson, Justin Herbert, Travis Kelce, Christian McCaffrey, maybe even Lamar Jackson. The 105 is an interesting pick.
The 105, Shawn, is going to be interesting. There's lots of potential options there. Obviously, players could fall to you, but we'll see what happens. I think that if Justin Jefferson's there, he is the pick. Travis Kelce would also be in the mix, but you never know in a draft like this. You may see some off the quarterback slide a little bit. As I mentioned in the intro, we will see some of the community maybe try and do some different things. We talk a lot about in the Superflex tournaments, doing a little something kind of contrarian. So it's going to be interesting to see how this draft falls. And we've talked on a few of the recent shows about the boards and how things may look as your draft progresses. But that's something that we have to keep in mind in this draft today as well, that things may go a little bit differently. So as the draft kicks off, we get Josh Allen, 101. We get Jalen Hurts at the 102. Patrick Mahomes, Justin Jefferson, Shawn, goes at the 104 to Tim. So we're up at the 105. And I mentioned the possibility of a quarterback falling in this draft. That gives you the option of Joe Burrow. If we wanted to go by ADP, he would be an option. The other one then for me as a non-quarterback that I would be targeting at this point is Travis Kelce and tight end premium. So what are your thoughts here? I would be leaning towards either Burrow or going tight end premium with the king of tight end premium and Travis Kelce.
Yeah, if you grab Travis Kelce here, then it gives you so much flexibility as you go through the rest of the draft. Even though this is super flex and that takes away one of the starting flex positions, we know that tight ends are going to be very important for this particular format. The Roster Construction Explorer tends to tell us that 3 or even 4 tight ends is the ideal approach, but you give yourself, number one, almost an extra starting spot, and number 2, flexibility. If you get a hit out of that quarterback at the top spot, Joe Burrow, someone I really like, thought he was very undervalued last year. He, Fields, and Jalen Hurts were our 3 big targets, along with, unfortunately, Trey Lance, who was injured and did not perform as well as the other 3. But Burrow up here at the 104, 105, that is more difficult because he has to hit on one of these legendary types of seasons the type of season that even for a quarterback like a Peyton Manning and Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, only comes around, once every 3, once every 4 years to really be a home run pick at this spot. And so for me, I think it's going to be Travis Kelce. It'll be interesting to see how the drafters attack the quarterback position. Also, understanding this balance between the hybrid QBs and the pass-oriented quarterbacks.
And Shawn, as you were talking through there, I'm going to start to share the draft board because I wanted to make sure we had that first pick on the card, I guess we'll say. And as we share it, listeners will be interested to see we get Christian McCaffrey went 1 pick after us. Then we get Lamar Jackson, Justin Fields, Kevin at the 109. I know you said about, and my fear sometimes with Burrow in this situation is the lack of rushing upside. But when we look here at the 109, it's a nice place to get him. Interesting as we work through the rest of the draft. We get Justin Herbert, then Jamar Chase, then we get into Cooper Kupp and Tyreek Hill back-to-back at the 112 for Ryan and Daniel. So we're going to see how it plays out. As we wait to get back to the mid-second round, Shawn, Trevor Lawrence goes off the board. Who is the ideal player here for you? Are we looking at this point to really continue to see what happens and avoid quarterback for these next couple of rounds? Obviously, somebody may slide back to us that may be too much to give up in the mid-second, but probably at this point we're letting it slide and seeing who some of those quarterback options are when we move into those mid rounds rather than second and third. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I think that once Trevor Lawrence goes off the board, then you're probably looking at a mid-round QB, which in this case would even be just Tua in round 3. You're looking at a variety of late round QBs. If not for the off the field stuff, I think we would be looking at Deshaun Watson. He's someone who we discussed on a show recently went from wildly overvalued to now perhaps marginally undervalued if a full offseason allows him to have an uptick in 2023. The other thing here is, again, as we're looking to build that foundation and get that flexibility, sort of an anchor running back to go with an anchor tight end is interesting. If Jonathan Taylor or Bijan Robinson are there, they would also be hard to pass up. But again, we know that the listeners are probably going to let running backs fall a little bit more. Again, they also understand that you lose a flex spot, so you have a little bit different dynamic. Colm, what are you looking at?
We are up. Yeah, so we are back up. As the draft has fallen, Jonathan Taylor did go 1 slot before us, Mark Andrews just before that. Diggs would have been a potential option for me. The players I've added to the queue, Shawn, are Barkley, you've mentioned Robinson, then A.J. Brown and Ceedee Lamb. One of the troubles in drafts like this that we've experienced in the past is passing on wide receiver is not usually a good option because we'll see that the listeners will want to really stock up on those wide receivers. So I wouldn't be against going with A.J. Brown or Ceedee Lamb here. You mentioned the kind of establishing that running back. So Bijan Robinson was one of the names. Barkley there also. All 4 are very interesting for me. Which way do you want to go as we have 10 seconds left?
Well, it sounded like you were pushing toward the wide receiver position. So let's go ahead and
sounds like Shawn has heard this podcast before.
We'll go ahead and grab Lamb.
I've gone for
he
a wide
finished
receiver.
out so well last year. I think that there is still – we got finally the secondary breakout from Lamb because of the way he has gently improved, we'll say. I think there's still a third breakout in there for him. Now, that's not guaranteed. Getting to that top level where you're at the Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams type of range to move in there as we watched Tyreek Hill do last season, to have that Stephon Diggs mid-career emergence where you're hitting it, maybe even not necessarily for a full season, but in 8-game stretches, and those 8-game stretches, could be the time period where you're pushing to the fantasy playoffs, and then you have that individual game upside that isn't just one game, but could be 3 games during the fantasy playoffs, and in this case, during a tournament that wins it for you. That's a difficult jump, but it's one that I think that we could get from Lamb. We also would expect with the change of coordinators that Lamb may get even more underneath targets. The floor for him, if he stays healthy, should be extremely high. Colm Robinson does go around the turn. We haven't had more quarterbacks go off the board. Kirk Cousins, Watson, Tua, those guys are there. Daniel Jones is a third-round ADP guy. He has that flexibility. He has the hybrid profile. Derrick Henry, someone who pushed our team last year. There are going to be a lot of options here. One of the options that I really like, it's a question of whether or not Breece Hall is going to be one of these guys who could immediately come back, or if he has the situation that we watched last year from J.K. Dobbins. The most recent reports for Javonte Williams, unfortunately, have been really pretty negative on him, and so he's likely to continue to tumble down draft boards as a result of that. We're a couple picks away. Two more guys are going to go before our selection. For anybody not watching on YouTube, the picks there were Devontae Adams, A.J. Brown, Robinson, Barkley, an excellent pick, Waddle, a guy that we like, really probably the same level as Lamb, and then Watson.
Yeah, so I was thinking, Amon-Ra or Waddle may sneak back, or one of the running backs, but Breece Hall is an option. Other players I've added into the queues, Kenneth Walker, you mentioned Tua. Then at wide receiver, I do like Garrett Wilson and T. Higgins, but I think that we probably could go with Tua or Breece Hall if one of those are available. And at the moment, there's one selection to go, so one of them will definitely be available. How do you feel about Tua, Shawn? I have him clearly ahead of the other quarterbacks that are in this range. We have Daniel Jones, Kirk Cousins, Russell Wilson, Jared Goff in this kind of zone. So he would be my pick at quarterback if we were going quarterback, or else the other option would be Hall or one of those two wide receivers. But I think here I'm leaning towards Hall or Tua.
Yeah, Tua is the guy who gives you a shot at a third-round QB that should produce first-round prices. Very similar, really.
I think if he hasn't the head trauma, if he hasn't the head trauma, I think he's going right up there with Justin Herbert and Justin Fields in this draft.
Perhaps if he had stayed healthy the entire season, the Dolphins would have put up such ridiculous numbers that he would have had to have been at least in that conversation. But he did have the head injury. That does matter. The other kind of minor dynamic in this is that both of his wide receivers have gone. I also think that we're going to get some good QB prices as we continue to traverse the draft. So I might really be leaning toward Hall here. Again, you're taking a little bit of an injury risk. We took some injury risks last year. Some of them paid off, some of them did not. But Hall would be my pick as the best running back currently in the NFL if we were to get back to 100%.
Let's go with Hall, and then we won't draft any running backs for the next 16 rounds, and we'll all be good. I think it's pretty close. I think Hall as well also has the option that could possibly jump right up and be in that range. When we're talking about Austin Eckler going as running back 2 in this, we have Jonathan Taylor. I do think, again, if Breece Hall stays healthy, and they are big ifs, he didn't stay healthy. He's coming back off quite a serious injury. So there's obviously a reason that he is not going in that range. But mid-third round, RB7, I think is pretty fair. I do think Tua, though, has the potential to really jump up and be, in that quarterback 7-8 range with the wide receivers that he has there. So interesting, though, Shawn, with the wide receivers. Dak Prescott with the quarterbacks. He went as quarterback 9. Then we get no quarterbacks to Deshaun Watson at quarterback 10, early third round. And that would be an interesting spot there that we could have picked up too, but it's right at the range he usually goes as quarterback 13. So normally, this is using the RotoViz draft grid when you're over at the FFPC dashboard. Usually Deshaun Watson goes right around the last pick or second last pick of the second round. So a couple of picks discount there, but we are now into the mid-third round. Kirk Cousins usually QB 11, Daniel Jones QB 12, Tua QB 13, and then Russell Wilson QB 14. All those guys are generally third-round picks by ADP in this contest. None of them have gone off the board yet in the mid-third. So, Shawn, there is a possibility that some of those guys could sneak back to us in the 4th or 5th, and we could get a real discount at the quarterback position. But we've started with Travis Kelce, Ceedee Lamb, and Breece Hall, and I think obviously there's more balance there than we would have it in certain drafts, but I think it's a pretty nice start to get those taste buds going as we kick things off.
And I like getting the balanced start in these Superflex drafts better than in most other formats. And it's, for me,
with the one less flex.
Yeah, and it's almost a zero QB type of pivot when you're looking for a way to create a power team in a tournament. We know that having the QBs early is a very high floor way to play it. And then when your position players stay healthy, it's a high ceiling way as well. And so if you get good health to go with those early QBs, that's the other way to build a team that not only just shreds your individual league, but puts you in position to win the overall tournament. We have 3 teams so far who have taken 2 QBs through 3 rounds. Kevin was able to go back-to-back out of the 9th pick with Joe Burrow and Dak Prescott. I think you have to really like that start. Eric was able to go with Jalen Hurts and Deshaun Watson with the 2nd pick, and then wrapping back around the 2nd pick in the 3rd round, so rounds 1 and 3. And then Touch of Green has gone out of the 8th pick with Justin Fields, and then does get Tua, which is about where he's going by ADP right now. I think if you have Fields, Tua, and then Stephon Diggs, that's a dream start. So we're going to like most of the rosters that folks put together here. And so, I mean, that part shouldn't be a surprise. What's going to be interesting to see is how individual drafters deal with the draft slots that they got, right? If you have the 101, 102, you're going to be able to do different things than the 111, 112. And at the same time, those drafters at the back will also have some different options. You look at Ryan and Daniel out of the last spot. They started Cooper Kupp, Tyreek Hill. That's the really fun type of thing that you can do in Superflex. And while they're going to have to make some really strong picks and do some interesting things structurally to make that work the rest of the way, that's part of the challenge. That's part of the fun of being in this position. And the fact that they didn't simply chase quarterback points or take an Austin Eckler, that type of thing, out of the 112, I like what they've done there. So now we get to see how they want to not really redeem that start, but how they're going to make that start work with their 18 further picks. So, Colm, in case it wasn't obvious, I'm really enjoying this draft, fired up to see what we do, and fired up for the listeners.
So, Shawn, just a quick recap. Since our last selection, it is Garrett Wilson, T. Higgins, Tua, Devontae Smith, TJ Hawkinson, then Travis Etienne, and Kyle Pitts. So we have 4 tight ends off the board through those opening 3 rounds. And it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out the rest off the way. When we look at Kyle Pitts, is usually tight end 4, but usually at the mid to back end of that 4th round. And again, it does sometimes become a little bit of a squeeze when you are moving in and people are taking those tight ends. It'll be interesting to see how the rest of the league now, as we draft, starts to see if there's a little bit of a squeeze on the position. Devontae Smith, also somebody who usually goes in the mid 4th round, going a little bit earlier, player we really like. So let's see how it plays out. Shawn, when we look back to some of the options that we may have available, it is still 6-7 picks till we will be back up. Russell Wilson has just gone off the board, but Kenneth Walker, who we talked about potentially at the last pick, is still there. I do think he'll be gone. George Kittle is there. Dallas Goedert is there. Daniel Jones, Deebo Samuel, DK Metcalf, Chris Olave. So we're going to have options when we get to that selection. We now have 1 running back, 1 wide receiver, 1 tight end. At this point, we can go in any direction. You can always go in the 4th round in any direction you want, but we can really let it go and see how it plays out here. Is there a dream pick for you when we get to this point? I would ideally be bouncing back to the wide receiver position again here. I think, though, if Kenneth Walker would be available, that would be a little bit too much for me to think about passing up in this range. Who's your dream pick here if we can make that pick 6 picks ahead? Mine may have been Deebo Samuel, who just went off the board.
Yeah, if you are able to get Kenneth Walker a full round below ADP, I think you have to take that. There are some concerns about how their offense will look, if he'll catch enough passes, and yet the talent that he demonstrated last year, not necessarily even that far off of Breece Hall. I mean, Kenneth Walker is a guy who we could be talking at midseason 2023 as one of the top 2 or 3 running backs in the entire NFL. We could see him just blowing by Saquon Barkley. We could see him up there with Jonathan Taylor. it'll be fascinating to watch where Robinson goes in the draft and then how his team deploys him. But if you're looking at McCaffrey, Robinson, maybe Taylor, Hall, Walker going past some of those guys, Walker going past Austin Eckler, who someone I have drafted in a number of drafts already. So I'm not out on him. And yet at the same time, Eckler at a huge risk of being the guy who collapses down the board this season. Yeah, I mean, if we have a shot at Walker here, I think you have to take it. The other one who would also be a full round below ADP and is a good fit is Daniel Jones. Probably he ends up back with the Giants. Obviously, there are the reports that he wants $45 million a year. A lot of teams are going to be skeptical of that. And at the same time, a lot of teams are going to look at him as one of the NFL's better arm talents and one of the best rushing QBs. You put some guys around him, you build the team correctly, and suddenly, I mean, we talked about him after the wild card upset as being, Josh Allen light, and then they get hammered by the Eagles, and it doesn't look quite as promising. And yet, I don't know. I mean, his 2023 and into the future, I don't think you can pass him here. And Colm, I kind of say that as he does make it back to our spot. Both of these guys.
So we have a decision to make. So we have the option of Daniel Jones or Kenneth Walker. I think they're the two clear options. I was going to put in my pitch, Shawn, for Kyler Murray. He went 2 picks before. I think Frank, one of our longtime listeners, somebody I got to meet over in Canton last year, gets him there ahead of us. But I'll let you decide, Shawn. I would lean here towards, I think I would still lean towards Kenneth Walker here, but which way do you want to go?
Yeah, well, that's still the more fun way. So we'll grab a Colm Kelly special. We'll see. I can't
believe I've pitched for the running back. I feel dirty now at this point.
Well, we know that the team drafting in the 4th spot, Tim, needs a QB. He would have to pass twice for Daniel Jones to get back around. The other 3 managers have a QB, but obviously if you get a guy that you like here as much as we like Daniel Jones, it's hard to see them passing on a second QB. So I don't think that he'll get back, but I mean, again, that's the joy of these listener leagues. You never know for sure what is going to happen. I was disappointed that Kyle Pitts didn't make it back to us. He's someone who by ADP would have been in that range. I think the 2 elite tight ends start here with some of the other positions being a little bit flatter than how they play out in other drafts. That would have been interesting. He obviously wasn't going to make it to us. Still a lot of reason.
So I think there's a lot of interesting things to play out over these next couple of picks. So you talked about Tim drafting next to us. He did go Josh Jacobs, and one of the reasons I was thinking about skipping over Kenneth Walker there is the other running back that I really do like in this range of the draft is DeAndre Swift. And I do think that he will potentially be there. If it wasn't an OT listener league, Shawn, I'd be very confident he would get back to us there in the mid-5th in this particular format. He may not in this situation, but I was thinking if we went Daniel Jones there, we could have then got DeAndre Swift. So it's going to be interesting if it's a case that Jones goes and then we have to take somebody else. Sometimes you can do those 2v2s of if we want Jones and Swift versus Walker, and whoever we end up getting could have been an interesting pairing. But let's see where that shakes out. The other one, Shawn, obviously you get more rushing upside with Daniel Jones. The other quarterback that's going to go in this range is Jared Goff. And obviously we were big on Jared Goff last year, but I think there's still upside to be tapped there this year. And then the savior of our team last year, Shawn, was a 20th round Geno Smith. He's not going in the 20th round this year, but he is somebody who I still think that there is potential room to improve based on what we've seen last year and how the offense played. I still think there's that, like where we were last year going into that offense, we thought it was going to be pretty good, but everyone else thought it was going to be terrible. But I think they could still potentially take another leap forward. Trey Lance does go off the board next. Those quarterbacks that I mentioned, Shawn, and Goff and Geno, the other quarterbacks in this range are your boy Derek Carr and my boy, who is not Shawn's boy, Aaron Rodgers. Out of those, have you? I think it's probably true. You have Daniel Jones a tier above that, but out of those guys, after if we missed out on Daniel Jones, any of those that stand out as potential options here at the 505?
I don't think so. There's just not enough that differentiates them from a scoring perspective to burn a high value pick here. I mean, there's a lot at the wide receiver position that we can get into. You mentioned Swift. I've had to move him down my board as a result of just the way that it seems like they want to use him. Yeah, if you're almost looking at him as a 2024 home run selection, that obviously doesn't help us here in 2023. Ramondre Stevenson, Tony Pollard, I think are probably better picks at this point. If Jamal Williams is back with the Lions, yes, you'd expect it to tilt a little bit more in the favor of Swift next year. And yet, I mean, in some ways, you're the lesser half of the committee from a high-value touch perspective. And he's going to get the high-value touches that we really, really care about in terms of those explosive receiving touches. He's going to score more touchdowns. Hopefully, he's going to stay healthy. But if you've established yourself as an injury-prone back and you're going to be in a complete committee, it's harder for me to get excited drafting him at these prices when Pollard is going to be in a committee in all likelihood. Again, there are some free agency things that we don't know 100% are locks. We tend to assume these things, and then you do get a few surprises. But if Pollard is in a committee with Ezekiel Elliott, that's much easier to navigate. It's hilarious to say that you can score points when your backup is Ezekiel Elliott as opposed to when it's Jamal Williams. And then just the other guy here, Ramondre Stevenson, I think probably deserves to be right there. I love Travis Etienne. He goes to the Achievers. The Achievers draft in a lot of these drafts with us. We love that team name. Obviously, we've got multiple Big Lebowski theme names in this. Carl Hungus drafting out of the 101 does take Daniel Jones and then DeAndre Swift. The picks from Derrick Henry at the 304 to around where we are here with potentially Pollard and Stevenson coming off, I think those guys are all arguably in one tier. And so if you can hit the back end of it, that's probably a good thing. Colm, we're potentially positioned to take three guys out of it, which would also not be a disaster, especially because, as we mentioned, Jones goes. But the other player I really wanted here was Jerry Jeudy. He's someone who well above ADP at wide receiver 19, the 502. That's where he should be going. Where he's going in actual drafts is far too low.
Yeah, no, I think he is going too low, and I think he went in a kind of appropriate spot here. I was hoping that he would come back. The other one I was going to have an interesting conversation to you about was George Kittle, who had slid a little bit, but he does go at the 503. So we're one pick away from and we'll be selecting Shawn. The other part is it's a pretty dry, flat area here in this particular draft for wide receiver. You would usually have other options here. There's a range where DK Metcalf, Chris Olave, DeAndre Hopkins may go. The only wide receiver that we really have in this range that we'd be looking at, and I think it's a little bit too early, but in this draft, Shawn, I'm going to pitch that it may not be too early, as Keenan Allen usually goes a little bit later. We are now sitting on the clock. Geno Smith was the selection before us. Do we want to get into a situation with that third running back? Do we want to reach here a little bit on one of these wide receivers, or do we want to look a little bit at Dallas Goedert?
I think because we've waited at QB, we have a chance to have this powerhouse team at the running back position that very few other teams in the tournament are going to be able to have. If we hit on our QBs, then this running back firepower could be the difference between finishing first and really any other result. I would like to go Stevenson here. Is that a pick that works for you?
It is. I'm going to have to have a shower after this draft's over.
So Colm doesn't like the fact that we've gone Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Ramondre Stevenson. As a result of that,
Shawn
we can
said
say
that we
very
went with
definitively that
we went with the
your
Ceedee
pick
Lamb
of
pick.
Ceedee Lamb in the second round, I mean, that was the way to go. It freed us up to do that. If we had taken Robinson there, then these other picks would have been a non-starter.
Yeah, and I like doing things that are a little bit different from time to time when we're doing these drafts. We've had a lot of success doing it, Shawn, that way, and having that trio, and you want to differentiate. It is quite unlikely. There's still a possibility that it will happen that we'll end up starting two quarterbacks every single week in those flex spots. But these running backs are the tight ends that we have picked up in Kelce, and other ones we'll pick up later. They can slot in there. And you mentioned kind of the comparative points on a week-to-week basis. I think the upside of the running backs we've drafted there and the quarterbacks that are kind of going in a similar range. I would have been very, very interested previously if we had got Kyler Murray to go two more picks there for us to the Kenneth Walker selection. So we did pass on Daniel Jones to take Kenneth Walker. He went before it came back. DeAndre Swift also went, Shawn, before it came back to us. Daniel Jones and DeAndre Swift, or Kenneth Walker and Ramondre Stevenson. Which duo would you prefer there?
I'm going to go with Walker and Stevenson.
That's because we picked them.
I mean, those running backs are going to score so many points if they stay healthy, and you have to draft with some of the optimism that they will if you're going to go ahead and make some of these running back selections. I love this team. And the big problem that we have with this team, which anybody listening in probably has been staring at from many miles away, is that normally when you start without a QB in the first 5 rounds, you're thinking, okay, well, we'll reach a little bit on Sam Howell. In this draft, you may have to reach a lot.
Multiple rounds.
Right. I mean, you may have to go, 6.
Sam Howell goes he goes the mid-10th round, quarterback 28. So we're at quarterback 18 now. Let's say, are we going to say that he goes before round 7 in this draft? Like before the end of round 7? I think that's a fair over-under.
Yeah, well, you mentioned he's up to QB 30 in what I'm looking at here, the first pick of the 11th round. So we're looking at very similar ADPs on the site. There are a lot of different things you can do to select what tournaments you want to look at, which time frames you want to look at. Obviously, Howell has been rising, but I mean, this is the range here where QB 30 is still an incredible discount on him. You have Mac Jones at QB 25, Jordan Love QB 27, Purdy at QB 28, Tannehill at QB 29. In the draft that we discussed a little bit recently on one of the shows, Blair and I selected actually 4 quarterbacks where we went with Young, Howell, Ritter, and Tannehill. That I think will be a little bit trickier to do here, but it may be something where we, in addition to not selecting a QB, that we also have to be off of Howell in this one again, just to kind of balance the different elements that we're looking at. And I mean, there are still some other guys. I think that too, in this one, when we're talking about how would you take some risks to build a team that could potentially win the tournament, this is one where maybe you're looking even at Will Levis and Anthony Richardson, despite the fact that their collegiate careers suggest that they will be busts. Just because the percentages work in a certain way, if you're getting a good price in a tournament, in a league, a draft like this one, where it makes sense to bet on the less likely outcome, you want to keep that in mind. You're not necessarily going to have 0% of Levis and Richardson just because you don't actually think that they're going to hit. And so I think that we have some options. Colm, I actually like the late quarterbacks from a fantasy perspective this year a little bit more than in some seasons, which, again, not surprisingly, that filters back through to some of the decisions we made early.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see because draft to draft, that's always going to switch up a little bit. And 2 of the players that I was hoping that may have slid in, we're getting into a kind of a veteran wide receiver range in terms of the tiers of players. DJ Moore goes off the board at the 509, then Keenan Allen on the next pick, Dallas Goedert, Matthew Stafford, Najee Harris, Christian Watson. So those 3 wide receivers were all wide receivers I would have been interested at this next selection. Drake London is still there, still available. He would probably be the preferred option if we get back here at wide receiver. Shawn, is there any other wide receivers? And this can be the tricky part when we're holding off, waiting off to see how things go. Anyone else standing out at the wide receiver position for you here when we get back to our next selection in this particular range? It's those last couple of picks put a little bit of a squeeze on, I think. I think Mike Williams could be interesting still there as well in that zone.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Christian Watson and Chris Godwin going, Keenan Allen going. Those are guys that we would have liked to get back to us. The top players by ADP tend to be people we're not on as much. Amari Cooper, Christian Kirk. It's not that Cooper won't have another solid season, but I mean, if you hit on him last season, this is probably the chance to get back off of him for 2023. Christian Kirk, a fantastic season. I think that the Jaguars' secondary receivers are pretty interesting. Ridley appears to be getting overdrafted. Kirk, Zay Jones, still quite probably the way to play that, or at least strong possibilities for guys who could hit again. But I think Despite the reticence or the fear associated with drafting Atlanta Falcons players after the 2022 debacle, Drake London, someone who, when we're looking at those year 2 wide receivers, he could take a massive step forward. Terry McLaurin is the safe pick. We usually don't go that route, but George Pickens, someone who could take a massive step forward. Kenny Pickett is still available. And so as we look at potential pairings as we move along, both of those guys are interesting because Ritter, Pickett, QBs you would expect to last. Now, Pickett may not last too much longer than this. It might be something where we need to go Pickens and then Pickett in round 7, which is maybe, again, above what I would prefer to pay for him. But those selections are interesting to me. Deontay Johnson is still there. He should bounce back this season. Marquise Brown, someone we selected in our last draft like this, he's still there. Colm, we're on the clock. The last couple of picks were Mike Williams, Javonte Williams, Aaron Rodgers. Gibbs went at running back. He would have been something I would have even made the pitch to you that maybe we select 4 consecutive runners. We're looking at a receiver here. Who do you like?
Yeah, I think Drake London. This is about 5 picks above where he normally goes, but based on the players that have gone, this is a range where normally the likes of Jerry Jeudy would go. Mike Williams is off the board. Christian Watson is off the board quite a while ago. So I think Drake London is the pick, and I think it could be interesting. The other players, Shawn, that are in this range, Jameson Williams, Deontay Johnson, who you mentioned. Ideally, I think we get 2 of those in this swing around. It's probably not going to happen, but yeah, I think Drake London is the play if we're hoping to get one of those guys potentially sliding back around.
So, Colm, we take
a deep breath. We now have 2 wide receivers.
We take London there. Ceedee Lamb, Drake London. It's not difficult at all to see a week 17 event where Lamb goes for 14 targets. London goes for 15 targets. You have to project a little bit of improvement, expansion of the Atlanta Falcons passing game to get there. But we know that London was very, very heavily targeted in the last month of the season. He and Desmond Ridder appeared to have a good rapport, even if the efficiency on those targets was lacking on many occasions. But again, with London, you saw most of what you wanted to see last season. He's capable of getting open underneath. He's capable of getting open deep. His lateral explosiveness for a receiver of that size is almost unparalleled. Contested catches were an issue. We tend to fade the contested catch and the drop element for receivers, as it's both not particularly predictive and also something that if the receiver just gets open often enough, doesn't come into play. I mean, if you're able to draw 150 targets on the season, you can fail to make a few catches and you're still going to be a big impact player for fantasy. If he does take a little bit of a step forward there, and when you watch his college film, he's just vacuuming everything up. Drake London's somebody at wide receiver 25. Sure, a little bit of the breakout is priced in, and yet if he jumps up to the Wilson Olave range, 2 guys who went at wide receiver 11, wide receiver 17, not that far apart positionally, but that's multiple rounds up. I'd almost be surprised if both of those guys don't outperform where they were selected, but also that London makes the move into that group.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see now over the next, I think, 12 months, there's going to be a lot of fluctuation in some of the wide receivers. There is those veterans which are really getting kind of beyond that age curve now, and then we're seeing some of these young guys come through over the last 1 to 3 seasons, and I think it's going to be a fun. It feels like we've been in a golden age of wide receivers, Shawn, but it feels like we're going to continue that as we move forward here. 6 selections gone. We have Travis Kelce, Ceedee Lamb, Drake London is our wide receiver 2 as things stand. We have Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Ramondre Stevenson. So more running backs than we may have, but I think you have to play this contest if you want to win the whole thing, not just the group, make your team a little bit unique. So we have no quarterbacks as things play out so far, but really exciting team so far, and I'm excited to see how it plays out. Shawn, we teased at the end of the last show. We didn't tease it, but our hopes were that we may have some wide receiver options coming back to us in this second set of selections. There is some potential quarterback options here for us as well, the likes of Kenny Pickett, but we did talk about George Pickens, Marquise Brown. You've talked about as being one of your favorite values this year. There's Jameson Williams is in this range as well, Deontay Johnson. So lots of things to look at. We are 2 selections away from our selection. Since we picked last, it's J.K. Dobbins, Calvin Ridley, Amari Cooper, Pat Fairmouth, Jahan Dotson, and then Christian Kirk and Derek Carr. So 1 selection to go for us, Shawn. We are in sometimes, the draft isn't falling the way you want. We are going to have a couple of options here for our next pick. Are you looking again at the wide receiver position? That is where I'm looking to go, or are you looking to take a jump on some of these quarterbacks? I think maybe the next round is where I would have those preferred options for a quarterback, but we are getting some value on players like Kenny Pickett at this point.
Exactly. Kenny Pickett, a mid-6th round pick. Bryce Young, an early 7th round pick. Both of those guys are still here. Pickett would be interesting because you can select him, and then probably you'll get a shot at either Pickens or Deontay Johnson in the next round. But Colm, it's hard for me not to just pick Pickens here, or go with Rashad Bateman, someone we think is a little bit undervalued and could be that massive 3rd-year breakout. Jackson Smith and Jigba could be the next Jamar Chase. You mentioned Marquise Brown as a value selection. This is one of the reasons we passed on quarterbacks. It's one of the reasons we passed on running backs. We really like the wide receiver value here, so it would be tough not to select a receiver. Do you have a guy who stands out for you?
No, and that's the reason at quarterback, I do think the player that stands out for me is Pickett. I would like all the wide receiver options. I think that they may, one of those may be available when it comes back to us in the next round. So I think the ADP value we're getting here on Pickett makes that pick even more appetizing. Do you want to go quarterback here?
Well, Colin, we got down to 5 seconds there. It sounded like you wanted Pickett. We went ahead and pulled the trigger. I kind of wanted to see how far we could really push it. And because there are multiple receivers there, if we had taken a receiver, we would have gotten another one in round 8 almost certainly. That would have given us the 4 receivers to go with those 3-star running backs, to go with Travis Kelce. Now, if you do that, is there a chance that you get wiped out at QB and all the rest of your picks are irrelevant? Yes. But for $35, that's one of the brilliant things about this tournament. You can take some of those risks. It's not going to cost you $1,500 to find out that you made a big draft mistake. We'll see. Just because we pick Kenny Pickett doesn't mean that we don't still have a lot of work to do at quarterback. So we're going to still get to see if the QBs fall. Selecting Kenny Pickett does not address our QB issue from a big picture perspective.
It sounds like Shawn is saying that if this team doesn't win, it's that we shouldn't have picked Kenny Pickett, and I made him pick Kenny Pickett there. It feels like that's the way that conversation was going. But I do like Pickett here. I think it's an interesting range and the ADP value that is sliding him down there. And I think that we'll potentially get one of those Steelers wide receivers coming back to us here in the next round. That is my positive thought. I'm putting it out there into the universe. We'll see what happens. I do think a player who's really interesting, we've only seen the flashes last year, Shawn, that's Jameson Williams. He may be there for us in the next round as well. Should be fully recovered from that injury. I think he could be a massive, massive smash this year upcoming. We were getting a little bit of, you mentioned we got down to the last couple of seconds there, Shawn. In the chat, on the FFPC chat with the listeners, I'm checking in every so often. We were getting a little bit of stick for taking too long to make our selections. I did explain that we're trying to record a podcast here as well at the same time. So,
well, we have been filibustering each other as usual, which is what we do like to do. Colm, the other position now that is interesting, we selected Travis Kelce in the first round, but in these FFPC tight end premium drafts, you got to load up. You have to have a lot of firepower at tight end. We have 5 teams that don't have a tight end yet. They'll obviously be under pressure to select one. This is a range where Dalton Schultz and Evan Ingram tend to go, and those guys I like. Both of them should be in fantastic situations for their offense next year, and beyond those players, there is a big cliff for me in terms of what the value does at tight end. It'll be interesting to see if over the next 5 to 10 picks we get some tight ends. It's interesting that the two teams in the back half of the draft who don't have a tight end yet, they each passed. And so the element there that we were kind of hoping for, where we could take Pickett and then a Steelers wide receiver, that is not going to play out because Deontay Johnson goes at the 708. George Pickens goes at the 710. Tight ends falling. I think Dalton Schultz and Evan Ingram will be in the mix for us. We get Aaron Jones, who has restructured and stayed with the Green Bay Packers. You might think that his value then would be a little bit higher as a result, but that's, again, part of the magic of these Superflex drafts. We're into round 7, and yet Aaron Jones is still there, and it'd be kind of hard to see how he could have gone earlier. The running backs who went in round 6, we have Gibbs, we have Javonte Williams, we have J.K. Dobbins. Dobbins, a player, in round 6 there, that is an obvious no-brainer. Tim has an interesting draft going out of the 104. That is Justin Jefferson, Devontae Adams, Derrick Henry, Josh Jacobs, Geno Smith, J.K. Dobbins, and Mike Evans. His team really pretty similar to the one that we have drafted. We have Pickett instead of Geno. We have the elite tight end. He's got more firepower at wide receiver, but I like how that one looks. We had mentioned that the other team that started wide receiver was out of the 12th slot. Ryan and Daniel started with Cooper Kupp and Tyreek Hill. They did come back and take Kyle Pitts. That's a fun selection. Then Russell Wilson and Matthew Stafford at QB, two of the best bounce back candidates in the entire NFL. You think about where they were going a season ago, and if they can recover even 85, 90% of their former magic, then they will be fantastic value picks. Also takes the value on Najee Harris. He's someone that we tend to fade, and yet when you're talking about the 601, that's a fantastic value pick as well. And then Cortland Sutton at the 712. That team is shaping up nicely. We talked about the challenge that they would face after they started wide receiver, and not surprisingly, they're handling it with aplomb.
So again, Shawn, a little bit of a recap as to what has happened so far. I was, putting out that positive vibe of, wide receivers lasting, making it back to us in the next selection. Since we picked Marquise Brown, Terry McLaurin, Deontay Johnson, Jackson Smith and Jigba, George Pickens, they're all wide receivers. We have Aaron Jones, Cortland Sutton, Treylon Burks, Evan Ingram, Tyler Lockett. So we have got a little bit of a run here. Jameson Williams, that next selection. So not as many options, Shawn, are certainly going to be there when it does manage to come back to us. By the queue of the players that we have at the moment, Rashad Bateman is the wide receiver that you potentially mentioned in that last round as well. He is still available. We are 3 selections away. He would be my selection here as we move forward. But you also mentioned Dalton Schultz being a potential option. As I mentioned, Evan Ingram has since gone off the board. Are you more frustrated with me for the Pickett pick since we made that selection?
No, there's never any frustration. You make the picks and you adjust to how the draft transpires. That's part of the fun of it. We get Gabe Davis here in round 8 as well. If the receivers go, you move to some of the other values. I'm excited to take Dalton Schultz here if we get him in the middle of round 8. I think a Kelce Schultz team gives you a lot of flexibility and upside, both in terms of building that weekly optimized lineup and then having different outs to win the tournament. Maybe Travis Kelce is stopped one of these weeks, and that eliminates most of the Kelce teams, but we have Schultz, and Schultz then carries us through, giving us Kelce against a non-Kelce final. That part of it would be perfect. So you're trying to think of what permutations would work to help you both advance to the finals and win the finals. I think that a lot of times those two objectives are placed in opposition to each other. There are some times when there can be some tensions, right? But you want to think about, how do I build a team that accomplishes both or increases the chances to accomplish both? So Rashad Bateman goes with the very final pick right ahead of us. Dalton Schultz is still there. Colm, I do like Quentin Johnston here. I do like Jordan Addison here. There's certainly nothing stopping us from taking a QB and bolstering that position, but it does feel like a Schultz pick to me.
Yeah, there's too much. Again, I'm not just going for players that have slid past ADP, but we're quite a bit past here for Schultz, which makes it a pretty solid pick, and it also will make a number of those teams who have yet to go tight end, it will put them at a disadvantage versus ours. They have gained an advantage in those situations by going quarterback, but they have yet to take tight ends. We can get a different advantage here to try and gain an edge on them. So yeah, I think that's the way to go. It is always interesting, Shawn, when we're doing these. This is a 20-round draft, and sometimes when you're setting up these teams, you get 2 tight ends in this range, and you think maybe you only need 2 tight ends, and that may be the case if you're in the underdog drafts, for example. But over at the FFPC with the tight end premium, there's just such an advantage to having those guys on your roster. But as we look, Shawn, as things settle so far at this point of the draft, that was our 8th selection. We have Kenny Pickett, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Ramondre Stevenson, and then it's Ceedee Lamb, Drake London, Travis Kelce, and Dalton Schultz. When we're looking through it, obviously we're having a little bit of a weaker wide receiver group, but as we've mentioned a number of times, the way the team is set up, it is Superflex, but at the FFPC, with the way the flex positions work out, you are not gaining an additional roster spot. What's happening is you are losing one of the regular flexes to become a Superflex. So wide receivers and filling that flex aren't as much of an advantage in that situation. So what are you looking at as we have gone through 8 picks, 12 picks left to go with? I don't think we need to talk about quarterbacks. We know kind of what we're doing with quarterback, but at running back, wide receiver, tight end, how are you looking the rest of the way through? Are you thinking 3 tight ends, probably 2 more running backs, and then filling the rest out with wide receivers, or how are you feeling? How we're looking at this point?
Well, running back does still have a couple of provocative names at the very least. You have Joe Mixon is still there. His slide after he more or less fell out of, you wouldn't say he fell out of the starting role, but definitely fell into a complete committee with Samaje Perine in the playoffs. He does go there at just before the 8-9 turn. Then you have Dameon Pierce, who looked fantastic for the Houston Texans. They're going to have a substantially rebuilt roster that could help him. There's a slight chance it could hurt him. He could end up in a little bit more of a legitimate committee this next year. And then Alvin Kamara, a back who no longer has the same fantasy profile because the current coaching staff of the New Orleans Saints doesn't seem to exactly know what they're doing. And he faces a suspension of indeterminate length. I think that he's more or less off of our board entirely, but those are interesting names that were there at that juncture. Unfortunately, the big development column, as we discuss some options for us, Sam Howell goes at the 8-12, goes to Carl Hungus, who has Josh Allen and Daniel Jones. That team now has 3 QBs with the elite hybrid profile, and that's the way to do it, right? Perhaps one of those guys get hurt. You'll still have the 2 other ones. Perhaps Howell busts, but you're going to still have Josh Allen and Daniel Jones. But this is a team now that could win the whole thing, even if Josh Allen got hurt. If you have the 101 and the guy gets hurt and you're still competitive, you put together a fantastic team. I think you have to love what they're doing there. And James Cook was the other pick. James Cook, another guy who appears substantially undervalued to me. In terms of what we're doing, we are going to be under pressure now with the QBs as Bryce Young also goes. But Quentin Johnston, Jordan Addison, I mean, this is the time of the year where you could potentially get a rookie wide receiver who's going to be a first rounder and then immediately blow up. You can get them at a discount now. In 3 months, these players are going to be much more expensive. Yeah,
I was very tempted, Shawn, when you brought it up in the last round to go that way to get the wide receiver. When we look at the options that may be available, we are on the clock at the moment. 2 picks ago, Brandon Ayuk would be a potential wide receiver option. Obviously not an option for us now, but we're looking in by ADP. You're into after the rookies. It's Brandon Cooks, Kadarius Toney, Darnell Mooney, Michael Thomas, Juju Smith-Schuster, Jacoby Myers. So I think both these rookies are very interesting options. Shawn, you are much more in touch with the rookie class than I am with the RotoViz rookie guide. I'm going to let you take the steering wheel here and pick which rookie you would prefer at this point.
Well, these guys have profiles that I think end up to be similarly valued. Let's go ahead and go with the potential massive winner in Quentin Johnston. Maybe the next Julio Jones. Maybe that happens only in year 2. Maybe Jordan Addison, who blew up as a sophomore in college, going over the 1,500 yards with Pittsburgh there. Maybe he's the guy who's able to get in there and adjust to the NFL level, be productive sooner. Both of those guys, I think, slam dunk picks right there.
So when we look, Shawn, at some of the other teams, we'll have a bit of time before it gets back to our group, but you mentioned pick 1 and pick 2. So we have pick 1 is Carl Hungus, it is Josh Allen, then we have Saquon Barkley, Jalen Waddle, Daniel Jones, DeAndre Swift, Pat Fairmouth, Jahan Dotson, Sam Howell, and James Cook. I think that's a very interesting team. They are one of the teams that have 3 quarterbacks so far. The other 2 of those actually been out of the 2 and 3 spot. Team 2 is Jalen Hurts, Bijan Robinson. Then we get Deshaun Watson, Michael Pittman, Jerry Jeudy, Amari Cooper, Christian Kirk, Darren Waller, Bryce Young. And Team 3 is Patrick Mahomes' team with AJ Brown, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Trey Lance, George Kittle, Calvin Ridley, Derek Carr, Joe Mixon, and Brandon Ayuk. And an interesting note in the chat, John, who did take Joe Mixon, did say that he didn't want to take Joe Mixon, but he just had to take him based on how long he was left on the board. So, Shawn, those teams all have 3 quarterbacks. We obviously have the 1 quarterback. Every other team at this point, barring Team 11, also has 2 quarterbacks. Team 11 with 1, and that is Trevor Lawrence, and us with Kenny Pickett. Looking through the rosters as things are playing out so far, any of the teams that you're really like? I know we're going to like a lot of these teams, but any personal favorite as to how things are playing out so far?
Right now, the thing that I'm most interested in or trying to figure out as we go through and see how it might affect our selections, you look at the way these teams have built at quarterback, and some of the teams that have been patient and may need some more quarterbacks, perhaps the teams that are competing with us. Now, one of the things that has happened so far is that teams that went QB early, they tend to be a little bit more QB focused, and they've been the first teams, not surprisingly, to get to that 3rd QB. But the team out of 4, Geno Smith and CJ Stroud, the team out of 6 with Jared Goff and Aaron Rodgers. As you mentioned, the achievers in the 11th slot only have Trevor Lawrence, and they do pass again like we did. So they made that same choice to see how the
mirroring the 1 quarterback. We both have 2 tight ends, both have 3 running backs, both have 3 wide receivers through those 9 picks. So there's a lot of similarities in the construction overall so far.
And the pick there is Tyler Algier going ahead of Alvin Kamara. That's an interesting one when you kind of think of the dynasty implications as well. Colm, we've done shows in the past talking about how this early best ball ADP gives you a window into what you should be thinking for dynasty trade values. When you get those trade offers of an Alvin Kamara and they're still much bigger than the offers for Tyler Algier, pretty clearly that's not the direction that the value is going to be going in. You want to be aware of that as you're thinking through what I would pay to get an Alvin Kamara. Because if you can get Kamara more or less thrown in at this point, which I think is a possibility in some leagues, then you want to look at that. Dalvin Cook ends up going at the 807, which, again, we get a sense of where he is now. I watched some of the maybe less experienced dynasty managers in the RotoViz Triflex formats pay for him with 2024 picks that overvalued who he is now. The Dalvin Cook managers have been really trying to unload him early this offseason before the bottom falls out. I think that's an interesting one. So Frank there out of 7 has built a team that is pretty cool. You mentioned the Kyler Murray pick. We don't know how long he's going to miss. The reports have been all over the place. I actually think that that'll probably be toward the optimistic side of that. I think that he's probably not going to miss as much time as people think. The key will be, does he have that hybrid ability at any point in 2023? But when you have Jackson, you have Murray, then you can probably take a little bit of risk for your QB3, but Mark Andrews as the tight end there. So you have the elite tight end, and then T. Higgins, Terry McLaurin, Kadarius Toney. But the running back values really jump out. And that team has Nick Chubb in round 5, Javonte Williams in round 6, Dalvin Cook in round 8. Again, cool things you can do on Superflex that maybe you can't do elsewhere. Colm, we also have maybe the first real flag plant selection in this draft, Anthony Richardson has just gone at the 10.04. Richardson, one of these very controversial prospects where he's been described as a mix of Cam Newton and Justin Fields. Other people would point out that he was not a good college player, and that can be a difficult profile to make work at the NFL level. As I mentioned earlier in the draft, and I believe on an earlier show in terms of how you're going to cut this up, but those QBs in Superflex worth taking a few stabs at as long as you don't get too much exposure, because even if the odds are against them, I mean, sometimes the long shots pay off. And then again, you have a league winner. I think in the 10th round, especially as we've gone here where you know that players like a Sam Howell are going to go before ADP, I think that's an interesting pick.
Yeah, and you mentioned that is the quarterback 28, Anthony Richardson. Before that, 2 picks earlier, we get Jordan Love, QB 27, then Ryan Tannehill. So since our last selection, 3 quarterbacks off the board, we are in a range where by QB rank, if we're not looking at ADP, we are right in the range where you would see Desmond Ridder or Will Levis. They're usually quarterback 31, quarterback 32. Anthony Richardson is usually quarterback 33 at the in the 12th round. The others going in the 11th. We are in the 10th round when we'll be selecting next, Shawn, in a couple of picks time. Have you interest in either of those guys to get them in here? There is some other interesting options, I do think, at wide receiver in this range. And the other player that I do think could be interesting is Greg Dulcich when we're looking at the tight end position. If we wanted to get that third tight end, we may not need it at this point of the draft, but I do think that he stands out for me as a potential option as well. And Mac Jones, I was going to mention him. I know you like Mac Jones, but he's just after going off the board.
Yeah, Mac Jones, an 8th round ADP. He goes in the middle of 10. That's going to be a good selection for the team that has Jared Goff and Aaron Rodgers. They've filled out that team with non-rushing QBs, but with a mix that on an individual game perspective could help them to hit the guys who go off that week. Colm, this is tricky here. I think that taking Jones first and hoping that the volume of QBs on these teams in between our selections might allow Ridder to get back to us, that was a possibility. I'm kind of feeling like Ridder, with his profile, with having Drake London on the team, I mean, the real risk that you run here is that there's a very substantial possibility that Ridder will not be the starting quarterback for the Falcons. But if he is, I mean, this is too much to pass up.
Yeah, I think it's too much to pass up. There's a chance, Shawn, that he won't be the quarterback, and that would just be a really bad sign for what the Falcons, invested in him, obviously, with last year's draft and to see how it moves forward. But I think they will give him a chance. I think outside of it being a case where they go ahead and draft somebody again this year with a high draft pick, which is still a possibility, I think that he will get an opportunity earlier in the season to lead that team. So I think with London there as well, to pair him up with his quarterback is a smart move. And when you look, the reason I brought up the options at QB, and obviously Mac Jones would have been in play, but when we look then after Anthony Richardson, obviously Tom Brady is QB 34, usually going in the 14th round. Tom Brady has retired. He may come back, I think this time it is, but he is not going to be there. The other options then, when we get into the 15th round, they're Jameis Winston, then Tanner McKee, you're into Zach Wilson then. Quarterbacks after that are Davis Mills, Baker Mayfield, Jacoby Brissett. So at this point, if we didn't take him there, Shawn, you're probably waiting till you're into those 18th and 19th kind of round range again. So it felt as well like a little bit of a potential final quarterback option. In this range, is there other quarterbacks that you would have been willing to take, or is it a case if we didn't take Ridder there, we don't get Levis potentially when it comes back? Are we really holding off into the deep, deep water?
I wouldn't say there are always ways that you can play it, because it is going to dry up and you can push it a little bit too far, especially in Superflex where you need some volume. But Garoppolo, somebody who with the number of teams that need starters, it would be surprising if Garoppolo doesn't start. There have definitely been reports that Mayfield is in more demand than Garoppolo is. It would be surprising if he doesn't start and he goes very late. I mean, he's someone we drafted on that team last year where we had the 4 QBs. We had Mayfield late. We had Geno Smith late. I wouldn't say that worked out because Mayfield didn't score a ton of points, but he was starting again during the fantasy playoffs. So he helped a little bit in that run that we made to the finals. part of being willing to push the QB position is that you're going to have to make some picks that aren't comfortable. And that's one of the things that we kind of like to do, is to make uncomfortable selections. Again, not to say that everyone should do that. You want to draft in the way that works best for you. You want to lean into your strengths. Well, we're comfortable making some of those picks. I don't mind Levis here. Again, I don't think that he's going to hit, but if he did, at this price, you're talking about it being a league-winning type of selection. Malik Willis, somebody too, who looked awful this last year, and probably in a lot of ways is similar to what we might expect from Levis and Anthony Richardson. But you do hear a lot of whispers that Tannehill will be on the move. The Titans then, again, have somewhat limited options for addressing that position. Do they want to bring in a guy like Garoppolo or Carr or Mayfield? And I mean, that's more or less just shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic, right? I mean, if you wanted that, why not just stick with Ryan Tannehill? To draft a guy there, you're going to have to take some risks. I mean, they may be in a position where they feel comfortable. I'm not really trusting Malik Willis, but at least experimenting with what he could bring in his second season. He's somebody I think we would have to look at late. Colm, we're a couple of picks away now. Bring us up to speed on who has gone and kind of what you're thinking.
Yeah, so since we selected Desmond Ridder, James Conner, Alvin Kamara, Dawson Knox, the pick, Shawn, there was two picks I was thinking, yeah, maybe these guys get back to us. I was very wrong. Carl Hunglison and pick one. They know what we're trying to do here. They're building a pretty nice team. They add in Rondell Moore and Wendell Robinson. They were two players I was hoping may get back to us, and then A.J. Dillon went off the board. So at this point, there's two more selections before it gets to us. I did mention Greg Dulcich earlier, Shawn. He has just gone off the board at the 11:03. I think a real impressive value there. Wide receiver options, Shawn, aren't as impressive at this particular point in time, but somebody who would be available if we did want to go that way, had a strong finish to last season, Isaiah Hodgins, and Will Levis did just go to Tim with that pick just before us. So we are up at this point, and a lot of running back options in the queue, the like of Brian Robinson, Rashad White is there, Miles Sanders is there. Any of the rookies, Shawn, really standing out for you at this particular point in time? Hodgson's, I think, is interesting, but is not the most exciting play. Anyone that is standing out here for you in this range?
Going back to the well with Sky Moore and seeing what he does in year two, I think that is a way that you can play it. Rashad White could have ended up being the starter next year in Tampa Bay. David Montgomery is going to be a big part of some committee somewhere. I think that he's the best value here. I don't necessarily like the picks at tight end. I don't think that we need to push QB. Are you comfortable with a Montgomery or with a Sky Moore pick?
Yeah, they're not, filling me with excitement, but I'm comfortable with both of them. It's hard to get excited about Sky Moore based on what we hoped heading into last season and how last season went from. Obviously, there was plays in the Super Bowl, but the season probably couldn't have went much more disappointing from where we were last offseason. But there's still a chance in that second year for him to continue that breakout. So we do take David Montgomery to add to that running back room. I think that he's one of those sort of players, Shawn, that we've never absolutely loved David Montgomery, but it's always been that he's been too expensive. It feels now that he is appropriately priced and maybe undervalued at his current price. That is the 11.05 that we have taken him there. But for me, holding my hands up, that this feels like a very flat period off the draft. I mentioned three of the players I did like, and Moore, Robinson, and Greg Dulcich, but it felt like it got pretty flat in that range, and those are all guys who usually are going multiple rounds after where they have just been picked up in this particular draft.
Yeah, you mentioned Wandale Robinson. He has been going in the 14th round. Rondell Moore, just a couple of picks ahead of him in round 14. Sky Moore has been going in round 13. There are a handful of the veterans that we're maybe not as fond of who go earlier. It's interesting that Elijah Moore, someone I still do have some enthusiasm for, has been at the 12:01, a couple rounds ahead of those guys that we think are must draft selections. You mentioned Isaiah Hodgins. I really like him from a reality perspective. I do think that you get Wandale back. You have Richie James, Isaiah Hodgins, and Wandale. And then, they have to add a number one. And, Ben likes to talk about how thinking of it in those terms is probably not the right way, and I agree with that completely. And yet, when we say they need to add a number one, they have to inject talent here, and that's going to adversely affect the target shares for all of these guys. And so it's not that I don't like Hodgins, but I think that when you look ahead to where they're going to be, I mean, he may not be a starter for them next season. That's not a risk that I necessarily want to take now on that type of player. When we think about guys like an Allen Lazard, somebody we loved who wasn't originally drafted, Hodgins, who didn't make it with his first team, some of these players who are RotoViz specials, it's important that we keep in mind what their range of outcomes are and what the depth chart is going to look like when you look ahead to next season. I mean, Allen Lazard was a player last year where, I mean, that was his chance. He had a solid season, and yet you could obviously see Christian Watson, Romeo Doubs, how they were going to be bigger parts of that passing attack than maybe it seemed like. It's something where we have to be careful about some of these veterans, and I don't know, we'll see how the draft continues to go. That's around 11. I mean, if he's still there at ADP in round 16, then maybe it would be a stronger possibility. You mentioned Dulcich. He gets picked in round 10 in this draft. He does slide into early round 11. I like Dulcich. I also like Mike Gesicki, who went one pick after us. I don't necessarily think that they were needs for our particular team. Dulcich, someone who could have a huge season in year 2 now that they have competent coaching. But one of the things that was really helping him is that he was a favorite of the departed coaching staff. I might still be sticking with Trey McBride as the guy I think can come out and be the superstar year 2 wide receiver. His ADP, much more palatable. You can generally get him in round 14, and then some late guys, Noah Fant, Jelani Woods, Dalton Kincaid. Kincaid might be the guy this season. You contrast his highlights with those of Michael Mayer, and it's not that the player who is maybe the more well-rounded pick isn't going to still also be a fantasy impact player, but obviously for fantasy, we are really emphasizing the receiving ability. I mean, Kincaid could perhaps be this year's Dulcich, in which case, if he ends up on a team that's more competent than last year's Broncos, maybe he really scores, can be that late contributor. Colm, you mentioned that this is a flat range. Are you surprised by any of the selections that have occurred since our pick? We're looking at late round 11, early round 12.
I think we're into a range. Now, you mentioned Elijah Moore. He does go at the 12:01, but it's kind of a veteran range. Like Michael Thomas is somebody who Frank takes here, and wide receiver 51. So it's fair enough, and that's where his ADP tends to be. But he is somebody who has restructured his contract with the Saints, and I think it's basically going to be a restructure so they can cut him this year. So I don't think he's going to be much of an impact player in the NFL and turn in fantasy. And we haven't seen him produce in the NFL in quite a number of seasons. So he is somebody who, I'm completely out on this year. Brandon Cooks is somebody who continues to produce no matter who his quarterback is and what his team is, but not in a great situation still. He goes after that. And then Juju Smith-Schuster. And the interesting thing, Shawn, that you mentioned in this particular point is when you were talking about the Giants and them looking for a potential wide receiver 1, the other player that is going kind of in this range who is relatively interesting, you mentioned Zay Jones earlier in this draft, but a lot of these teams, things are going to change a lot. He's in a situation where the wide receiver 1 may already be on the roster after coming over from the Atlanta Falcons and Calvin Ridley. So there's a lot of things changing pieces and moving pieces. And when we get into this range, there's a lot of those players with many, many question marks going on their heads. A player that you mentioned as well, Trey McBride, who I really like, he goes one pick ahead of us. I don't think he was in the conversation in this. And this is where it gets difficult. Sometimes we're talking about, like later in the draft, these players are interesting, but they're obviously going now because we like them and the listeners know we like them. Sky Moore, though, Shawn, is somebody who's still there, still available, who could be of interest. Brian Robinson's there, Brock Purdy's there. Again, feels to me another bit of a flat zone. I would probably be looking at Zay Jones or Sky Moore at this particular point. Donovan Peoples-Jones is there also.
Yeah, and the other player who could really jump if he's the first-round pick in the reality draft would be Kayshon Boutte. Jimmy Garoppolo, an interesting pick and now 3 rounds below ADP. But I think that we have to take the risk that every team in between this selection and our round 13 selection already has 3 quarterbacks, because they have 3 and because they've spent quite a bit to acquire those guys. None of those quarterbacks in terms of QB2 was selected after round 4. So those teams are probably set. I should say that the one team that is a little bit different there would be, again, the team out of 4 that started at Jefferson, Devontae Adams. They now have Geno Smith, CJ Stroud, Will Levis. Not impossible that they would go with 4 QBs, as Blair and I did in one of our recent drafts, but they're probably going to be looking at some more firepower at wide receiver to take a second QB with the rookie. But even once you have Justin Jefferson and Devontae Adams, when your only other wide receiver is Mike Evans at this point, again, I kind of think that they will go receiver wrapping back around as opposed to Garoppolo. The other question that we have is whether or not Garoppolo really is the guy. If we take him, we're almost kind of moving toward a 4 QB build, because you're probably looking at a Willis late. You're perhaps looking at a Mayfield late. Purdy is not gone in this draft, as everyone appears to be fairly skeptical about his recovery from the NFC Championship game injury. His surgery recently was put off. That's never a promising sign. Colm, QB versus some of the other players who are available here. How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, I was thinking the exact same way you were, Shawn, that the other teams having the 3 quarterbacks unlikely to go and add that draft capital onto it. So a potential 4 quarterback build. I think when we wait on quarterback like we have here, I think you are putting yourself into the realms of a 4 quarterback build. So I am very much open here to going with Jimmy Garoppolo, who has slid quite a bit past ADP. Brock Purdy is there. You mentioned at the end of the last show his injury concerns. Who are you looking to slide in here at this particular point? 30 seconds left. I think Garoppolo is a pretty smart play here.
Yeah, so when we're looking at QBs, we're sort of looking at those areas that the other talent available becomes very flat. Now, you wait to this point, and the QB you're getting isn't going to be anything that blows you away either. But if we were not going to take a QB, I almost think Jamal Williams would be the pick, and that's just too gross. I'm not going to be taking Jamal Williams in drafts.
Touchdown machine.
So, yes, you get all of those touchdowns again inevitably, and never do we see a guy like a Damian Harris score a ton of touchdowns and then take a step back. But Williams, Ezekiel Elliott, Kareem Hunt, Leonard Fournette, Deontay Foreman, Elijah Mitchell, Sean Tucker, a guy I have in Debbie quite a bit and am enthusiastic about, at least very much excited to see what he does in the combine column. That may have already happened by the time you release this show. But Sean Tucker, someone we'll be keeping an eye on. Devin Singletary, our guy, still there. So there's a lot of depth still available at running back, but no immediacy in terms of having to get one of these guys on the roster. At wide receiver, I don't think that's so much the case as it's just absolutely barren. The next player I like here is probably John Mechie, who goes much, much, much later than this. Curtis Samuel, vaguely interesting with Eric Bieniemy on board. Tyquan Thornton. I mean, those are the guys really looking at wide receiver, which raises the question of whether or not we're strong enough at that position. Our receivers are Lamb, London, Quentin Johnston, and Sky Moore. You have 3 very young players, 2 second-year guys, 1 rookie. That might actually be a bigger weakness on this roster than is the QB position. So that's something to keep an eye on as we move through the draft. The other thing that just happened is that Dalton Kincaid went in round 13. I'm sure there were a lot of participants who were hoping to land him, who were wondering where he would go. Again, that ADP is sitting in round 18. There was no chance that he would make it to that point, but still round 13. That's probably where the value is. So I think that's a good selection from Kevin, whose other tight end is Chig Okonkwo. Kind of like we're at with the wide receiver position, Kevin's tight ends have some pretty fun upside. They have absolutely no floor, but it's fun. We like to see drafters take some of that risk. I think if you have a Okonkwo as your only tight end through 12 rounds, then you need to make a selection like Kincaid, somebody who could come out and maybe be the next rookie standout, as opposed to taking a low ceiling guy who just never does anything for your roster. Those players will be available in rounds 17, 18, 19. There's no reason to take them here. So Brock Purdy does go. He is the third QB for the Achievers, who now have Trevor Lawrence, Jordan Love, and Brock Purdy. My guess is that every team in this draft is happy with their QB position. Nobody gets caught out entirely. Obviously, the teams like ours, where your QBs are not potent, you'd love to have more firepower, but you made that decision on purpose to get better production at some of the other selections. We really have 3 teams who have sort of faded QB. The other 9 are fairly strong at QB. That's what I would expect to see in most of these drafts. Again, this experiment here has been a lot of fun so far. The drafters doing a great job with it. Colm, we're headed into round 14 now. How do you see the landscape overall? How do you see what we need to do?
I think it's pretty interesting. I think all teams, as you can see, have different kind of initiatives or agendas in place as to how they are going to construct the teams. I do think we're seeing a lot of the teams be able to make those changes on the fly, which is something that I think is obviously we want to see, because they're listening to our content, they're making smart draft decisions, and that's what you want to see as teams pivot and make those right choices. So as things stand for us, Shawn, I think we're looking before the end of the draft to add another tight end. I think we're going to need to add another quarterback, and I really do think that we are going to have to flesh this roster out quite considerably at wide receiver. It is a situation, though, that it's not that exciting at the wide receiver position. You mentioned some of the options that, you know, when you want to potentially go in and get your next wide receiver at John Mechie, who is quite a bit away from here, Shawn. So if we're not looking at wide receiver at this point, where would we potentially be looking? There is some running back options that I'd be interested in, but based on our roster construction so far, I don't think that is the right way to go. For people interested, some of the running backs that are in this range, Shawn mentioned Jamal Williams, but Dante Foreman's here, the likes of a Leonard Fournette, for example, but the Devin Singletary is here, Rashad Penny is here, obviously working through injury, and then somebody like Samaje Perine would be in this range. But when we're looking through the options, Shawn, at wide receiver, it isn't very appetizing at this particular point. Tight end, though, Daniel Bellinger would be a potential option there. Isaiah Likely is there, Noah Fant. They're also players that kind of are not really exactly in this range, usually a round or two later than where we'd be discussing at this point in time. So what I'm trying to say is the players that I like most at this moment in time are the players that are multiple rounds ahead of ADP.
Well, one of the things that happened to us 2 years ago on the team that finished second to Connor in the regular best ball tournament is that we ended up with a lot of running back firepower, and we didn't have a second wide receiver to score enough to jump Connor in the last day. And so, I mean, you can obviously get locked out at receiver, even if you tend to be a receiver heavy drafter, but that team with the running back firepower carried us to that point. And if the value is really at the running back position, I think that's where you have to draft it. Right now we have 4 running backs, we have 4 wide receivers. I mean, you can make those flex positions running back spots, you know, if that's the best option for you as a drafter. And so I think that we do have to look at Tucker here. He would probably be my guy. I mean, at some point, Jamal Williams is a pick that I think you have to make. Those would probably be the 2 players. Devin Singletary still available. I don't think that there's a wide receiver that justifies a 14th round pick.
Well, let's go with Tucker. I'm always on board with rookies getting in, but the wide receivers are so flat here. It's unfortunate. And that is, Shawn, that's historically speaking, the RotoViz OT listeners will make wide receivers very flat as we get into these mid rounds, because we'll see a lot of those wide receivers drafted at this point. Dante Foreman was another player, Shawn, that if we were going running back, I was interested in. You hyped him up on a recent draft with his some big bold predictions on his big performances. Was he in the mix there with Tucker, or are you clearly ahead on Tucker than Foreman?
Well, I think that you are referring to
Chuba Hubbard.
To Chuba, yeah, who, I mean, there's never a bad time to draft him. He does go here at the 1402. His actual ADP is in round 16. And so even though all the value is at running back, we still are having some of the RV guys taken. Jamal Williams does finally go. That's to a team that didn't select a running back until round 8, but John now has Joe Mixon, Alvin Kamara, Kenneth Gainwell, Brian Robinson, and Jamal Williams. Even though some of those names are fallers, some of those names are out of fashion, it does, again, allow you to see how much value is available at running back. You can definitely take a zero RB approach to this particular format. We did not, but it is viable. Colm, as we start to wrap around here, our pick was the second in a string of 4 running backs in 5 picks. We're obviously not the only drafters who see this as being a better range for running back. And as I say that, Miller and Tank Bigsby, 2 of the really fun rookies, guys I probably would have hoped that we could get in round 15. They go at the turn. Carl Hungus continues his rookie drafting ways. That is 3 in a row for him. Now we move into a time period where there aren't a lot of fun selections at any position. Rashad Penny starts to be a little bit more interesting.
What about Noah Fant?
Fant is somebody who, because he disappointed last season, does tend to fall. I think that makes him a strong pick here. I mean, the possibility for him to take a big step forward. I mean, from a dynasty perspective, he's a must acquire, whether it happens this year or next year. I mean, I think that Fant has too much receiving upside, and receiving is too important in the contemporary NFL for him to just sort of languish in the same role that he was in last year. The other name I would mention here, Jelani Woods, someone who was very trendy at a couple of moments late in the season, and now there's uncertainty about who the QB will be, how that offense will work. But I don't know that there is a justifiable gap between Okonkwo and Woods, and maybe Woods is someone we could even get if we allow it to wrap around one more time. Colm, Mechie might be a guy we should go to here and not get sniped in a listener draft. Tyquan Thornton, maybe in that same boat. You've been pushing for receiver. We do have 3 or 4 good choices here. I'll let you make the pick.
Well, I would rather go wide receiver if you want to do that option. I do think that I would probably rather Thornton, but I know you like Mechie. I think there'll be one of those tight ends available to us when it comes back. That's the reason that I would be more. And I do think with who's drafting along with us here, those wide receivers will probably not come back. And with the options we have so far, with the 4 wide receivers we have taken, I think getting Thornton there makes sense. You've mentioned Mechie a few times, Shawn, over the course of some of our recent podcasts. How are you feeling about him in terms of, sometimes you'll mention a player and listeners may think, I need to draft him in all my drafts, but how is your excitement level for Mechie heading into this season?
Yeah, I think you want to continue to track how the health is there. You need to continue to track the offseason moves that the Houston Texans make. I'm looking at that as a team where you have Brandon Cooks departing, Nico Collins, someone who probably has always been a little bit overrated. Now, some of the things holding him back are just very poor QB play as well. But I think if you take the guy with maybe even a wider range of outcomes, a player we haven't already seen sort of flounder at the NFL level, someone they drafted early and clearly wanted to be a big part of what they did last season. Now, some of that is going to change as you have a new regime in place. We'll start to get some signals about whether he still is the guy as the offseason moves along. And one of the other things there, you'll find out a little bit more about his health. But I think that there is an opportunity for him in Houston that really wouldn't exist in about 30 other teams. But because he happens to be on the Texans, he's an interesting guy to select this late.
And Shawn, you mentioned a moment ago when we took our selection of Sean Tucker, but before that, Devin Akane went, and then after that, it's Zach Ertz, Jamal Williams, Elijah Mitchell, Kendry Miller, Tank Bigsby. Then we get Kareem Hunt, Isaiah Hodgins, who we talked about a little bit earlier, and then Leonard Fournette. So we have had a run there. We take Thornton, then Tyjae Spears goes. So there's a range there where there's only 3 running back selections and basically a full round of picks. So we did talk about it getting a little bit flat for wide receiver, but to take Thornton there, I think was an interesting pick. Frank takes Alec Pierce after that, who I think is somebody who, there's going to be an upgrade here in terms of the overall play, I think, for the 2023 season in Indianapolis. So we'll see how he does as well. Shawn, I think that I feel relieved after getting the wide receiver pick there. I did also hype up, and this really did not work out for us earlier when I talked about potentially getting one of the wide receivers we wanted back earlier after the Kenny Pickett pick. That did not work out for us in the way that I had anticipated. But at the moment, none of those tight ends have come off the board. I think Fant is clearly the tight end that I would pick if we have an option for both of them. We may have an option for none of them if things play out the way that they normally do. But you mentioned Woods. I thought he looked very good in certain points of last season, but there's still a huge amount of rawness to what we've seen of him in the NFL. Do you think that is the case, that he is still a very raw project that is coming out here? I don't know if we'll see the overall consistency from him.
Yeah, he was one of the really high ceiling, really low floor players coming out of the last draft. During draft season, he was probably trendier than McBride and Dulcich because of the athletic metrics. His testing at the combine, absolutely fantastic. And then you're in this situation where the Indianapolis Colts are not a good offense. They're especially bad as a passing offense, and they're using other tight ends instead of him. So the enthusiasm falls to more or less zero. He's available in obviously all redraft leagues 2/3 of the way through the season. And then it's a fairly strong finish. So for him, again, we have a very wide range of outcomes for his second year, but the Indianapolis Colts need weapons, right? You have Jonathan Taylor as your superstar running back, and you have Michael Pittman as probably not a star receiver, but a guy who fits into that second tier. But you've got to add guys around Pittman in the passing game. They have some hopes for Alec Pierce. Every once in a while, Paris Campbell does some things. But this is a team that, beyond just the quarterback position, is a team that needs more talent. And I think from that perspective, Woods is a guy who could emerge. And anytime that you have this big athletic tight end, if he does hit, then it changes your offense and it forces NFL defenses to attack you in a completely different fashion. They're going to have a lot of incentive to make him one of the focal points. The question then is, does he deserve that? Can he live up to that? That's the part of it that we don't know the answer to. It also may simply be a situation where the quarterback play again in 2023, because the Colts are one of these teams that consistently puts themselves in a position where it's difficult to find the answer. Do they have one of the rookies, and does that rookie help them take the next step? I kind of think that he does. And so I guess I'm probably enthusiastic about what the Colts will look like, and even enthusiastic for Michael Pittman, who was more or less on our do not draft list last season. I think last season's prices didn't make any sense. The flip side of that is that this season's prices are really pretty favorable for Pittman and some of the other Colts.
Yeah, I think that's what I was kind of getting at, but I didn't want to be, too overboard. But I think based on, unfortunately, Matt Ryan's play, and they've been in a kind of a merry-go-round where they've been kind of stuck in a kind of quarterback purgatory that has kind of circled around year after year with Phillip Rivers. They obviously had a number of guys that have come in and played at the quarterback position for them. I think maybe it would make the most sense for them to see if one of these rookies is the answer, rather than continuing to throw kind of good money after bad to try and see if they can solve it. Because it comes to your mind that maybe somebody like a Garoppolo or could come in and do the job. But yeah, it's a tricky situation from what they've had, and I think all options are going to be an upgrade for Michael Pittman and the entire wide receiver crew there. But Shawn, we have an option actually for both off the tight ends. I think for me, Noah Fant is an absolute must draft here. Are you going to twist my arm to go in a different direction, or are we going to go with Noah Fant?
We can go with Fant here. I think the other pick that is potentially compelling would be Rashad Penny. Anytime that he is healthy, he is a top 5 back in the NFL. A lot of uncertainty surrounding him right now. As soon as those questions are answered, even if they're answered in a way that is not particularly favorable, I think that you will see him become more expensive. The other element of it is that once we find out which of the rookie running backs actually don't go into favorable situations, guys who go late or who are more or less blocked by 2 players, those backs are going to fall out of this range, be more 19, 20 round picks. That'll move Penny up a little bit. So I think that the prices that we are getting on him right now are probably better than what we will get later. It's always a possibility that he goes, vaguely in that Will Fuller route, but I don't think any of us are expecting Rashad Penny to retire. He does go to Tim a couple of picks later. So we take, I should say the very next pick. So we take Noah Fant in the middle of the 16th round. Rashad Penny becomes the 1609. Colm, we still have plenty of other guys that we like.
And just on your point there, I do think Penny would be a player that I would absolutely be targeting in this range if we hadn't already, invested so much at the quarterback position, or sorry, at the running back position. I might just run Shawn to fill up my water. Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Just give me 1 second. Were you going to reply to me, or had you something you were going to say there?
Just that I don't think we really have that many running backs.
Do you not know? Add it in just to say then. I think it'd be.
We get a little bit of a feel for just how few running backs Colm wants there, because we only have 5. And again, there are going to be a lot of different ways to attack that Superflex position. One of the things that helps you if you're a little bit weaker at QB is to hit on some of these other positions. You don't have to have 2 quarterbacks in. Colm, on the final week where we finished in the middle of the pack in last year's Superflex tournament in the finals, we didn't start 2 QBs. And you say, well, that's why you finished middle of the pack as opposed to winning the tournament. But you can get some scores from some other positions. That's something we want to make sure that we do and consider as we work through here. We are now 1 pick away. Jelani Woods does go in the interim as well. Not that we would have taken a 4th tight end, but that gives you a sense of where listeners are also seeing the value. We were Fant versus Woods, and Woods does go a few picks later. At running back, Penny goes, but then Alexander Madison, Jalen Warren, 2 guys who would have been, I don't know that Warren was really in the mix for us, but he's a good selection there, I think. There's no question about that. Most of the rookies have now dried up. At running back, Zamir White is an interesting potential breakout player. Pierre Strong, I think, if Damian Harris departs in free agency, someone who could be a huge scorer if anything were to happen to Ramondre Stevenson. He's probably a little bit less exciting because we already have Stevenson on this particular roster. At the wide receiver position, Marvin Mims, not somebody who is going in FFPC drafts currently, but he's probably my wide receiver 4 in this upcoming draft. We've talked about him on a few of the shows, so Colm, it might make sense to go ahead and pick him and just be sure not to lose him there. I'm probably wrong about Mims. He seems to be much, much further down the list for most draftniks, and yet, I mean, the profile is there. I don't really understand why Mims would be so far out of the mix.
Yeah, if there's ever a time to do it, Shawn, the time is now. And if there's ever a time to go a little bit earlier than we might want to, the time is now. So The time might be now for Mims. Is 2023 the time, though? The time to draft him was now, but the time for the breakout.
The Mims was excellent as a freshman in college. He's the guy who is much more likely to immediately transition successfully to the NFL than these players who took most of their college careers to even get comfortable with college football. That would be my pitch for him. Written an article about him recently. You can get some nuggets in both the first episode of the guide, and then we'll have a lot more coming out in volume 2. We appreciate everyone who has purchased the RotoViz rookie guide. Colm, we're now a little bit more balanced at the receiver position. We are young. We like that. We have 2 rookies. We have 3 second-year players, and then to put them with Ceedee Lamb, who was our foundation piece. I like the way that that is built. We've got 3 tight ends that we like. I mean, this is a balanced team, and balance has been one of our themes for the Superflex format. Albert O goes 1 pick after us. That's to a team that really waited at tight end, and that's an interesting move. So that team now has Mike Gesicki, Trey McBride, Juwan Johnson, and Albert O. Another of the teams that waited was out of the 8th slot. They went with Cole Kmet in round 9, and then Tyler Higbee and Gerald Everett in rounds 13 and 14. I think really the only questions about Higbee and Everett that have made their prices very palatable there is whether or not they were specific situational tight ends from the perspective of injuries at the wide receiver positions in both Los Angeles franchises created a lot more volume for them than you would expect to have. And then there have been whispers in the offseason that these guys could be salary cap casualties. If they had to find their way on different teams, then probably these prices would make more sense. If they end up back in a similar situation, even if the volume isn't quite the way that it was in 2022, when you're talking about round 13, round 14, those are picks I think you still have quite a bit of excitement about. We had mentioned the third team that had waited, that had a Okonkwo and then Dalton Kincaid as the first 2. That team goes with Isaiah Likely in round 15. The Baltimore Ravens and their passing attack as they get to a new offensive coordinator in 2023. That will be a team to watch, to monitor. They have so little talent at the receiving positions that it's easy to look at that team and say, this year more than last, and as tight ends get into that year 2, and we reference Blair Andrews' work with the year 2 breakouts for tight ends, if they can go with Likely and Mark Andrews together a little bit more often, if they can get Likely more involved, I like him as a potential breakout. You're hoping that the offense is designed in such a way that he doesn't need a Mark Andrews injury to be relevant. But now we get a sense of how the teams that waited at tight end, how they were going to address it. You can see their balance of upside and floor. They've done a nice job there. Colm, we have 3 picks remaining. What are you looking at from a positional perspective? Who are the names that appeal to you the most for these last 3 picks?
The first thing I want to mention, Shawn, we're talking about positional perspective. You said that we only had 5 running backs, and that shows that I didn't want to draft any running backs. We now have 6 wide receivers, so we have finally passed the number of wide receivers that we have of running backs. So I think that we're in a good spot. I think that also means that we have a lot of options of what we do over these next 3 picks. I did mention previously that I think another quarterback is probably something that I would probably do to round this team out of one of those 3 picks. If we're looking at quarterback, the name that really probably stands out the most and is, I think, Malik Willis. Baker Mayfield is somebody who you touched on earlier. He is there. Sam Darnold is there as a potential option. So there's a couple of options. Bailey Zappi is also there. So there's really 4 quarterbacks that you could potentially look at here moving forward. But my preferred option would probably be to see if we can get a little bit of a step forward here from Willis in year 2 versus the other guys. But at this point of the draft, they are certainly in the mix. And I think then we're probably looking at, I think we have the strength in this roster at the tight end position in Kelce, Schultz, and Fant. I wouldn't be against taking another one, but I do think that a lot of the depth at the tight end position is completely wiped out at this point. We're down at this point of the draft to tight end 32. Cade Otton was tight end 32 in the late 17th round. So there's not a huge amount of available options there moving forward. So I'm really probably looking at one of each position at quarterback, running back, and wide receiver here, Shawn, as we finish things out. And I think we're probably looking at some rookies at those positions as well.
And that's the way that I see it too. So we're very much on the same page. Willis, somebody who, because of the fantasy profile specifically, you want to look at him. The receivers, getting one more would be nice if there is any option who will work at all. The names that we currently have in the queue, MVS, we'll see if he remains with the Kansas City Chiefs. If he does, even if he has another disappointing season, you're looking at a couple games of production. Khalil Shakir could be the number 2. I don't think it's impossible that he passes Gabe Davis in the pecking order. The real concern that you would have is that the Bills emphasize that position in free agency in the draft, and that even if he moves ahead of Davis, he slides down further just because they actually want to make sure that position doesn't cause them the problems that it arguably caused them in their divisional round loss to the Cincinnati Bengals. We have Rashee Rice as a name in the queue. He's one of the players who I think offers sort of a stark contrast with Mims in terms of what their collegiate trajectories were. I think that he's being overprojected as a first or second round pick in the reality draft. But if he does get that kind of draft capital, then you're looking at him as a player that the team is going to push into opportunities. And even if those opportunities don't come to fruition in the first half of the season, the team is going to try him out. He'll get a lot of targets in the second half. That is obviously where you win fantasy leagues. It's also where you're going to need to have players to address the bye week issues and injuries that continue to mount up as the season goes along. So while not really a target, if he also falls because the rest of the league is not looking at him as well, then that would be a possibility. Hunter Renfrow, the top player here by ADP and by a wide margin. I mean, he's about the least interesting player in the NFL after the way 2022 went and his disappointment coming off of a very strong 2021. There were all these thoughts that he might be either Wes Welker or Julian Edelman, and then injuries wiped him out entirely. And the offense didn't really translate from the Patriots to the Raiders the way I'm sure Josh McDaniels was hoping. Hard to have confidence in that play. And again, it's just not a fun play. And so that's one reason that he will fall. But we know from Blair's research also, and again, anyone who's interested in this, make sure you do check out the wrong read, that the veteran players deep here do tend to be the guys who win leagues. So we'll keep his name kind of in the emergency category. Colm, we just got up in round 18. The last handful of picks were kind of fun. 3 of the running backs I was interested in went, and Pierre Strong, Kenny McIntosh, and Dwayne McBride. That probably pushes us off that position. And to Malik Willis. Did you have somebody else that we should be considering as well?
No, I think Malik Willis is the way I would go. I was actually quite interested in MVS if he had lasted. He went at the 1806, which was 2 selections before us to Frank. Not the most exciting player in the world, but has that profile where, and I was actually surprised that it didn't happen more often or really at all in Kansas City this year. We've seen his ability to work down the field and to have those big plays. We did see him get in the end zone a little bit towards the end of the season, but I was surprised as to how little it worked down the field for him. You know, obviously they were trying to replace Tyreek Hill and doing that through a multiple amount of players, but MVS, a little surprising. But when we're looking at the players in this range, you mentioned Hunter Renfrow, who goes to selection after us to Tim, but Adam Thielen is in there, Allen Robinson is in there, and obviously we mentioned Hunter Renfrow. So there's quite a few wide receivers in this range who are really at the veteran end of their career. Robert Woods is in this range as well. But I don't think that MVS should be, I would have him a tier above these guys. And obviously that's splitting hairs because that tier is very low down the pecking order. But I think there is potential left, particularly in best ball. There's potential left in the tank for MVS to be able to contribute those big games versus what the other guys are going to do there. So do you think is that the way you're setting those up, Shawn, that he is, I guess we'll say he has a little bit of upside left where the other guys have no upside left?
Yeah, I think that's the way to put it. If you look at some of the guys who have already gone, like a David Bell, we liked him, and yet
Yeah.
his rookie season was about as bad as is humanly possible. Paris Campbell and Khalil Shakir both go a couple picks later. We know the way that they really project in terms of both floor and ceiling compared to somebody like MVS. I guess my concern would be, and we haven't really heard any whispers to this effect, or at least I haven't seen them if they are out there. And again, this podcast recorded a decent amount before released. So in the interim, there may be developments. I guess if I'm running the Kansas City Chiefs, MVS is probably cut. And then if he's cut from Kansas City and he can't do anything with Patrick Mahomes, then I think you could even argue that he goes a tier below the players who are currently being drafted. Because if you can't make it work with the Chiefs and you didn't really emerge with Aaron Rodgers, do the other 30 NFL teams look at you and feel like you're the answer? Probably not. But I mean, those are things we might have said about someone like Zay Jones in the past as well. And, you know, he had a fantastic season last year. So we wouldn't say that it's a 0% chance, but MVS does still need to stay with Kansas City. And even there, and you're probably only getting his score into your lineup 2 or 3 times. But that's where we are when we're taking players in round 18, round 19. It wraps back around. Colm and Baker Mayfield is still there. We could go with 5 quarterbacks. The other name that I put into the queue here, I mean, we weren't going to be able to get most of our signature players in this draft. We didn't get to Sam Howell. We didn't get Dalton Kincaid. We reached a little bit on Marvin Mims. I mean, is it KJ Hamler time?
I think it should be. I think just for old time's sake, it definitely should be. I think looking those Shawn, the other player I was going to ask, obviously coming off an injury and missed all of last season, but Tim Patrick being a Bronco as well as somebody who was going down in this range, I think that will be interesting to track that recovery. But I'm on board with KJ Hamler if that's the way you want to go. I'll never turn down a KJ Hamler selection. KJ Hamler could be like the wide receiver version of Rashad Penny, where you just have to keep drafting him every single year until the year that it just wins you all your leagues. Is that what we're going for?
Yeah, I mean, it's KJ Hamler. He's still a top 30 NFL wide receiver. So we'll see what happens to him now that you have a competent coaching staff in place. I mean, really, when the player is trendy, that's not the time that you want to be on him. So you could argue that the only reason he's been trendy in the past would be that we were overdrafting him. But I like the way he fits in to this team. Jerry Jeudy emerging as an absolute star, but Courtland Sutton probably just a guy. They need the speed and the playmaking ability. They need the vertical element of a KJ Hamler if they're going to be able to pull a failing quarterback like Russell Wilson back from the brink. You've got to have that talent out there. Perhaps he can be, again, the thing that people talked about last year, maybe it's just a year early in terms of him emerging as the Tyler Lockett in that offense. And if nothing else, selecting KJ Hamler, always good karma.
Always good karma, and adds another wide receiver, which is also good. So, Shawn, we just have one selection left at this particular point. When we talked after our 17th pick, we kind of said we would like a quarterback, a wide receiver, and a running back. Are you still looking to add that additional running back if the option is there when it comes back in the 20th round? James Robinson is somebody who's in the queue. Zamir White, you mentioned, as a potential breakout candidate. They are both in the queue as available options. Is running back the preferred option here as things slide back around?
Yeah, it's a possibility. Rice is still there, and the argument we made for him a few minutes ago still applies. If he is your pick with the 8th selection in round 20, I think you're okay seeing what happens over the next couple of months. And maybe that's a player who really adds a lot of value. I like James Robinson. I think that Zamir White is somebody that you'd have to consider really carefully. I do feel a little bit of that regret at this point that we've made 4 quarterback selections, because if Baker Mayfield is there at the end of round 20, I think that you would have to look at him as a very real option. Colm, what's your feeling here? Burning another roster spot versus having that Superflex position, flexibility, knowing how strong our roster is at the other positions because we waited on tight end, and knowing the relatively limited chances that any non-QB pays off. If we're talking about a potential starting QB versus any other player drafted in round 20, the payoffs there seem very skewed to the quarterback.
Shawn, what I'm going to say here is what I'm going to say here is we took one Geno Smith in the 20th round last year. Baker Mayfield could be. Is he ready to go and bring us on that journey again here? The point I would make, and you've already kind of touched on it, is any non-quarterback is not going to have the potential upside at this particular point. Well, I won't say that's not that it's not any chance, but there's a strong likelihood that Baker Mayfield is going to outscore any of these guys if he's a starting quarterback in the NFL. The other thing is that because we waited on quarterback, I do think having the upside there, like, realistically, if we get a 20th round running back here, the possibility that he's going to be outscoring all of the running backs on a weekly basis that we have here is unlikely, barring all these running backs getting injured. So, funnily enough, at this point of the draft, the position I'm least confident in is the wide receiver position, and I think we do have we've made a couple of very, very nice picks since the 10th round to strengthen that position with Hamler, Mims, Thornton, and Sky Moore, adding them in there. So I would not be against a 5 quarterback build is not what I had set out to do here, but I did think we were probably in the range of 4. So I wouldn't completely be against it. Have you checked how that works out in the winning percentages here? Is it optimal? Has it ever been done before, Shawn? That is the question.
Well, certainly you're going to have teams that have.
It's going to be a limited sample size.
QBs, but especially this time of the year, too, because what we're trying to do with these picks is to have as few throwaway picks as possible. That's the other reason that I really like waiting on quarterback at this time of the season, where in August, perhaps you wouldn't, because you got a better sense of the other types of players or the other specific names who are exciting in round 20. Right now, that doesn't apply in nearly the same way. So I think if you're going to wait on QB, if you're going to do a 0 QB build, and then, as you mentioned, splurge and take more than the optimal number, now would be the time to do it. I think that taking a QB versus throwing the pick away is a pretty straightforward decision.
Yeah. Okay, let's go. We are going to do a follow-up podcast as well after the draft finishes up, which is going to talk through some of the teams, some of our thoughts. But yeah, Shawn, some of the questions have come in already in the chat as if we could, and we're going to save this as a teaser, if we could change one pick, what it would be. And I'm guessing that when we answer that question, it's going to be that one of these quarterbacks would not have been a quarterback pick earlier in the draft. But we'll hold off and we'll save that for a future time. But Shawn, as we look through our team finishing up this draft, is Travis Kelce, Ceedee Lamb, Breece Hall, Kenneth Walker, Ramondre Stevenson, Drake London, Kenny Pickett, Dalton Schultz, Quentin Nelson, and Desmond Ridder. That was our opening 10 picks. Our final 10 picks then are David Montgomery, Sky Moore, Jimmy Garoppolo, Sean Tucker. Then we get Tyquan Thornton, Noah Fant, Marvin Mims, Malik Willis, KJ Hamler, and Baker Mayfield. So rounding it out, it is a 5 quarterback build, but we still have 15 other selections that aren't quarterbacks, Shawn. That's what we're looking at. Lots of youth in there. I think lots of talent in there. So we will recap that on an upcoming show. As always, make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get all shows once they are available. Thank you for tuning in and listening through the draft process as we make each and every pick while on the clock, talking through our thought process as to why we are going in that direction. I hope you've enjoyed watching along. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can check out all of Shawn's work on rotoviz.com. And until we are back with another show, have a good one.